Looking at where the wind's going at the moment, with all that rain coming from behind us, it may come in your direction. Again, just watch your camera lenses, watch the children's eyes, watch your sandwiches or your ice creams if you've got them out. If during the course of the display we have to call an emergency for any reason, we will be asking you all please to walk out of the arena, walk to the far side of the car park, gather your group together there, make sure you can account for everybody, and please wait over there for further instructions from us. Please don't do the obvious thing and get back in the car to leave the site. That may cause us more problems. But we hope we don't have any issues like that today. Now, we're going to start our display by bringing on a number of vehicles or types of vehicles that the military uses. And the very first type we're going to have a look at is a relatively small vehicle, but it's actually a very important vehicle on the battlefield. Even in this day and age where we've got spy satellites up in the sky, when we've got things like unmanned drones, little aeroplanes that can bring us back live pictures, even in this day and age, the best information an armoured force commander can get is by sending out someone in a vehicle out ahead of the main troops who can radio in real time back exactly what they're seeing. And to do that, you need little vehicles like this one that's coming on now. It's what the military would call a scouting or reconnaissance vehicle. And the idea is you go ahead of the main force, find out where the enemy are, radio that information back. What you don't do is you don't pick a fight with the enemy. That's not your job. That's the guys coming up behind you with the bigger vehicles, especially the tanks, obviously. Now, this particular reconnaissance vehicle, it's called the Lynx, and it was originally made for the Canadian Army, designed back in the 1970s. A number of countries used it, and very kindly the Canadian Army gave us this example when it came out of service. It's an ideal reconnaissance vehicle for a couple of reasons. One, it's small. If you're small on the battlefield, it means that you're going to be harder to see and also harder to hit if you're trying to knock it out. You're the enemy. Trying to train your guns on this as it whips around the battlefield, smaller the target, harder it is to hit. The other issue with this is it's relatively fast for a tracked vehicle. And again, the faster you are, the harder it is for the enemy to actually catch up with you with their guns to try and knock you out. Now, inside this vehicle, there would have been a crew of 3. You can see the driver at the moment. He's in the front with his head out the hatch. If he comes under fire at all, he will close that hatch down and look through little glass periscopes that surround the hatch. Now, you can look through some of those periscopes inside the museum. The idea, of course, is that if a bullet or shrapnel from a shell hits the outside of the glass, it may crack the glass, but nothing comes inside to wound the crew member or damage the vehicle. And most periscopes, they have a quick relief lever on the side, they turn this little knob, out drops the old periscope, you always carry spares, in goes a new one, and off you go again, so you can see where you're going. The downside of periscopes, when you look through them, it's like looking at the world through a glass fish tank. So quite often you'll find drivers and commanders of armoured vehicles will keep their heads out the vehicle till the last possible moment so that they can have that sense of spatial awareness. They know what's going on around them and only close their hatches down at the last moment when they really do come under fire. Now, behind the commander, the driver, you can see sitting in the front, the round hatch that's open, that's where the commander would sit. And he'd be the ones with the binoculars looking out for where the enemy are. And inside, behind the driver, there's a radio operator. He's the one that's radioing back all the information they find. Now, on the side of the front of the vehicle, you'll see these stubby little tubes. And you'll see that on a lot of armoured vehicles in the museum. Sometimes they're on the front wings of vehicles, sometimes on the turret sides. Now, they're what's called smoke dischargers, and inside each one of those tubes, about the size of a Coke can, is a smoke grenade. And if the vehicle comes under attack, the driver or commander can press a button, out flies the smoke grenades in front of the vehicle, nice big smoke screen builds up, and you can retreat or manoeuvre without being seen by the enemy. So it's a very useful feature, special for reconnaissance, because you might bump into the enemy, need to get out of the way without them seeing you or being able to train their guns on you. You can see it's got a machine gun on it. That's what they call a 50 caliber Browning machine gun. It was invented way back just after the First World War. Lots of armies, including our own, are still using it to this day because it's so good. It fires a massive great slug of a bullet. If it went in one end of your car, it would quite happily go all the way through your car and out the other end without stopping. Very, very powerful machine gun. And that particular one, the honest truth is, it's carried on this vehicle for a bit of moral support for the crew, rather than for taking on the enemy. If you bump into the enemy, quick burst of machine gun fire and then back off quick. Information, not fighting. That's what this vehicle's about. Now there's many debates in the military about what's the best way of doing reconnaissance. Should you have a tracked vehicle like this one, or what about a wheeled vehicle, which quite often are quieter? And the British Army has gone from wheels to tracks, and at the moment we've got tracks. We used to have wheels a lot of the time. The downside of those tracks, you can hear them. Tracks tend to be noisier. The good side about tracks is you can go to places that wheeled vehicles just can't get to. Vehicle, again, how the military thinks. That's got the same engine, the same track, a lot of components inside it that came from a whole family of vehicles that were built around the same engine, the same track. And the idea there, of course, is once you're off on campaign, your supplies and your spare parts, the fewer different types of vehicles you've got, or the fewer different types of engines you need to keep running, the better. So there's a whole family of vehicles that the Canadians and the Americans built around that same engine, same set of tracks. Now the next vehicle coming on, you can tell, not a tank again, looks a bit like a box on track, but again a very important vehicle in military terms. This is what the military would call an APC, or Armoured Personnel Carrier. Now those of you who've seen our First World War trench display, you can see in World War I, the idea of the tanks were there to go across no man's land, crush down the barbed wire, and let our infantry follow on behind. And for that reason, tanks in the First World War, they only went at about 3 or 4 miles an hour, which is about marching pace. By the Second World War, tanks are doing many other things. They're much faster and they've got many more roles on the battlefield. And that's when people start designing vehicles to put soldiers in the back of the vehicle rather than have them marching on behind the tanks. Now after the Second World War, pretty much every country that built a tank built a vehicle like this. A box on tracks, put a section of soldiers in the back and let that keep up with the tanks when they're going into combat. Now the soldiers in this vehicle, they don't actually fight from inside the vehicle. When it's time for them to do their fighting, they jump out the door at the back and they finish the attack on foot. But sometimes vehicles like this are called battle taxis. They're there to get the soldiers to where the fighting is safely. And the armour plate on this vehicle, it will stop a bullet, but not much else. So you don't want to be hanging around on the battlefield too long. Now this particular vehicle, it was designed for the British Army back in the 1960s, and it's called FV Fighting Vehicle 432. It never got a nice name, it's got its production number still. And in the back of this vehicle today, we've got some recruits. We picked out the audience a bit earlier on, and they're going to give you a wave now, and there are volunteers. There they are in the back. We've given them a helmet, we've given them a gun, and we've given them a uniform. And a bit later on in this display, they're going to show you how a vehicle like this might be used in a combat situation. Now, as you can see, the hatches are open at the moment. When it goes into combat, again, driver at the front will close his hatch. The commander sitting behind would close his hatch, and those big round hatches where the infantry are waving from at the moment, they'd be closed as well. The door they jump in and out of is at the back, so they've got a bit of protection when the vehicle stops. And again, sometimes this vehicle was fitted with a machine gun, but the honest truth is, again, it's really like a delivery vehicle. It's not really a vehicle for fighting from. Now the 432 went into service back at the end of the 1960s. It's actually still in service with the British Army today. And like a lot of armoured vehicles, over its service line, it goes back to the factories, had new engines, new braking systems, and when it goes into combat nowadays, they bolt lots of extra armour on the outside, and they're calling it Bulldog. But when they train with it, it looks very much like this vehicle, and you may see vehicles just like this one driving the roads here at Bovington as they're doing driver training. And by the way, it's got a red L sticker on the back. Do remember, just like when you were passing your driver's test, L stickers, a learner driver, give them plenty of room, because most of the drivers in these vehicles, they can see diddly squat out the back, and when they turn corners, the rear end quite often kicks out. So don't go overtaking at the wrong moment, because they'll knock you in the ditch and they won't even know they've done it. So plenty of room if you come across a track vehicle doing its training around the roads here at Bovington. Now, because the 432 was such a simple and useful vehicle for the British Army, they did lots of variants on it. Some were made into ambulances, some were used as command posts, some were used to carry radio and engineering equipment. So it's a very commonly used and very numerous vehicle. The main armoured personnel carrier the Army use nowadays is something called the Warrior, and that's a bigger vehicle with a turret on the top, so the soldiers can actually fight from the vehicle rather than just be delivered by it. And you may see the Warrior, it's in use in Afghanistan, and again they train on the roads around here. It's a much faster vehicle as well than this 432. The Warrior is much faster because when they deliver the troops, they want to be able to do it very, very quickly. So they actually gave the Warrior armoured personnel carrier the engine out of a destroyer. It was basically a starter motor from a destroyer, and that can whip the vehicle around the battlefield very, very quickly, because again, speed is a good defence. If you're quicker, the enemy might not be able to knock you out. So that was an armoured personnel carrier. We will see a tank, don't worry in a moment, but before we see a tank, again, another very, very important vehicle for the military. This is what the military would call a logistics or a supply vehicle. And this particular one that's coming on now is something called an M548, Model 548. It was designed originally for the American Army, but lots of countries around the world bought it. This particular one was used by the British Army in the First Gulf War, and we use them for carrying anti-aircraft missile supplies forward to replenish our regular air defence batteries. And the idea is really like a Ford Transit on tracks. It's there to deliver the supplies up to where the tanks have got to. Now, you've all seen the Army has big fleets of very big butch trucks with massive wheels on. The trouble is, when a tank's gone forward across the battlefield, it may have got to places that the normal wheeled vehicles can't get to. And if you're going to keep that Army supplied, or those tanks supplied with fuel, spare parts, ammunition, food for the troops, you're going to need another track vehicle like this to get to the same places. As I said earlier, wheels can't always go to the same places tanks can go. So this vehicle has got a flatbed in the back for loading the supplies in. What we've done, the Army, when they took them out of service, they gave us a number of these vehicles. What we've done here at Bovington is we've actually put bus seats in the back. And if you fancy what it's like having a go in a track vehicle, this vehicle will be running from the far side of our arena throughout the rest of the afternoon. Health and safety, again, I'm afraid you've got to be over a metre tall to have a go in it. But it does give you a bit of an idea what it feels like bouncing around in the back of a track vehicle. It's also a good example of how a track vehicle works. Tracks are there to spread the weight out of a heavy vehicle across the ground. The only wheels that are powered on this vehicle, like most track vehicles, are the ones with the teeth in. And now these are the ones on the front here. And the idea is you lay down your own roadway, that's the tracks, you bite into that roadway with the toothed wheel that's on the front, that's powered by the engine, you pull yourself along those tracks, The wheels that are resting on the tracks on the ground, as it were, they're not powered at all. They're just taking the weight of the vehicle and spreading it out across the tracks. The wheel at the back is just keeping the track nice and tense so it doesn't flop off. So you lay down your own roadway, bite into it, pull yourself along it, pick it up behind you and throw it forward again. So all that to spread the weight of a whopping great heavy vehicle out over the ground. If you took the tracks off, it would sink into the ground with that number of wheels, those pressure points under the wheels. And they were so clever with track design, they got the weight, or the ground pressure as it's called, underneath the track to less than that of a human foot. So very, very clever in spreading the weight of up to 60, 70 tons, some of these big heavy tanks are. You can go to places now where before that 60 or 70 tons, if it was on 4 or even 6 wheels, it would sink in the ground. Now the driver in the front, he doesn't have a steering wheel, he's got 2 sticks to drive this vehicle for steering. The idea, a very simple system, if you pull back on the right-hand stick, it brakes the track. In other words, it slows the track on the right-hand side down. The other side keeps going, so it pushes the vehicle round the corner. You pull the left stick, you turn left. If you pull both sticks back together, the idea is it comes to a dead halt. The downside of that system, a bit like driving a car, when you put on the brakes all the time, you can wear out the base brake very, very quickly. And that's why when you see these vehicles go around our arena, they tend not to go in a gentle arc, they tend to go in a straight line like the edge of a 50p piece. Pull on the stick, change the angle, another straight line, another pull on the stick, and that stops you overheating the brakes too much. If you keep the brake on, they may wear out quickly or get very hot and stick. Now a proper tank coming on, you'll be pleased to see. This is a tank coming on now, but if you watch all your History Channel and Discovery Channel and all these documentaries on the television about tanks, lots of rude things are said about this vehicle, but the honest truth is this is pretty much the tank that saved our bacon in World War II. This is the American Sherman tank, and this one that's coming on now is one that was made late in the war. It's got lots of improvements on it compared to the first one. But it really is a tank that was very, very important to us. Now if you look inside the museum, you can see the tanks that the British Army had at the beginning of World War II. And despite all the myths, they weren't actually that bad. They were pretty much comparable in quality and numbers when we joined up with the French to the German army at the time. What the problem was, the Germans had already started building much bigger and much better tanks. We left all our tanks behind us in France in 1940, so we carried on building the same older tanks instead of designing newer ones. The Germans have got newer ones coming forward. Where we were good, we sent our engineers out to America to help them build firstly the M3 Grant tank and then this tank. And the British Army were actually the first army to use the Sherman in combat at the Battle of El Alamein. And we thought it was a great tank when it went into action for the first time. Why was it such a good tank? It had got a dual-purpose 75mm medium velocity gun. So what does all that waffle mean? Dual purpose, it can fire shells out the end of the barrel, some that blow up, that's high explosives, and throw metal around, so if you're trying to knock out infantry or artillery in the open, you fire higher explosives. It could also fire armour-piercing rounds, and they're solid lumps of metal that you just fire with as much welly behind to smash your way through an armoured emplacement or another tank. Now our own tanks could fire one type or the other, they couldn't fire both types. The American Sherman could do that. 75mm is the size of the gun, 7.5 centimetres across the hole at the end of the barrel, so we call that a 75mm gun. Medium velocity, the rounds come out with a medium amount of force. So we thought that was a really, really good gun. Now this one was made later in the war, this Sherman. It's got a 76mm gun, so it's only a millimetre bigger, but this is what they call a high velocity gun. As the war progressed, we realised It was much better that a tank had a good anti-tank system on it. In other words, a gun that could fire those armour-piercing rounds well. So this one is a high-velocity gun, but I have to say, even this gun, when it came out later in the war in 1944, it still wasn't a match for those much bigger German tanks. But the key thing to remember in tank warfare is numbers. We all get very excited about that famous Tiger tank we've got in the museum, our Tiger 1. 1,300 of those made by the Germans in World War II. Over 50,000 Sherman tanks were made by the Americans. So this was really a matter. It's all very well, if you play top trumps, the Tiger's going to win. But there was always 6 or 7 Shermans. Very rough on the Allied tank crews, but they were going to sweep away with their quantity the German quality in the end. So that's a very key thing to remember. And I'll be testing you later, by the way, on all these things I'm telling you. 5-man crew inside the vehicle, 3 guys up in the turret. Commander, he sits out, he's on the left-hand side, he's telling the driver where to go. He's obviously looking out for targets all the time. On the other side of the turret from him is a loader. And if you ever have to pick a tank crew, always pick a loader who's short, stocky, built like a Russian shot putter, because the rate of fire of this tank will go down as he gets worn out. So he's picking up those big 75, or in this case 76mm shells, whacking them in the breech of the gun. The person who fires them is a gunner who sits in the turret just in front of the commander. He's the one with the telescopic sight. He's got a little hand grip to turn the turret around on, and when he's ready to fire, he's got a pedal on the floor. He stamps on that, and that fires that big 76mm gun. In the front, as you face it, on the right, with his hatch open, you can see him at the moment, or most of you can, is a driver. Again, he's got 2 sticks in front of him. If he comes under fire, he pulls a lever on his seat, the seat drops down, he closes his hatch, and he looks out of a periscope. And on the other side from the driver is a bow machine gunner. And the bow machine gunner would often take over from the driver when, if the driver got worn out, because driving a tank is very, very tiring and very stressful. So a lot of you as 5 crew members, you're trained to do at least 2 roles so you can take over if someone's wounded or away from the tank. So, as I said, we thought it was a good tank, even though it wasn't a match for the better German tanks, but there was always going to be numbers of Shermans made. Because they made so many, they actually had to do 3 different engines because they couldn't make just enough of the one type of engine. This particular tank's got a diesel engine in the back. Some of them had petrol. And again, another one of those myths is the Germans called our tanks or Sherman tanks Tommy cookers. Actually, it wasn't because of the engines when they caught on fire and burned. It was mainly because of the ammunition inside. And before the end of the war, they came up with a very clever way of storing the ammunition, basically in boxes surrounded by water. So if a spark got into the vehicle, it shouldn't ignite your ammunition you're carrying. It would be put out by these water jackets where you stowed your ammunition. Now in this vehicle, the engine is at the back, and it takes the power through to the front of the vehicle, where you can see that tooth wheel. The driver sits right next to the gearbox, which is at the front of the vehicle, and the transmission that then goes out to actually power the vehicle along. And in the Second World War, tanks, when they went into action, obviously they were rarely on their own. There was at least 3 or 4 tanks in a troop, part of a much bigger regiment that would be attacking or squadron at the same time. But when tanks attacked in the Second World War, their gunnery was tough. And quite often you would have to fire about 3 rounds before you were onto the target. So quite often it was 1 round over, 1 round under, and the 3rd round was about on. And you had to do this. You had to stop to aim the gun before you could fire it. And of course, you can imagine the downside of that. The minute you stop, you're a much easier target for the enemy gunners to aim at and try and hit. So after the Second World War, they designed guns that could be fired accurately on the move. And that made you, again, a much harder target for the enemy to try and knock out. So many Sherman tanks made, lots of countries used them well after the Second World War, and only the very, up to the 1980s, the Israeli army was still using them. This particular Sherman, it was used by the Canadian army before it was gifted to the Tank Museum. And another great feature that the British Army loved about the Sherman, it was reliable. And every summer this Sherman tank comes out and runs around for us. And again, it's a great tribute to that American engineering. You can have the best tank in the world, but if it doesn't start in the morning, it's no good to anyone. So being reliable was another very, very important feature for a tank crew. Now, I've been waffling on for about 25 minutes and you're getting bored out there, so this is the moment we want to wake you all up and ask you a few questions and see if you were paying attention earlier on. First question, are you all on holiday? I'm not that boring. Are you all on holiday? Thank you, that's more like it. So in other words, you probably didn't do what you normally do if you've been back at home this morning, like turn on the breakfast news or get your normal paper out. Because if you did, you would have seen the very disturbing news that last night down at Lulworth, the Ruritanian army landed. And I wouldn't laugh, because the Ruritanians are a nasty lot, and we know they're heading this way to capture that very important mound behind us with the Union flag flying on it. Now, if there's any big kids or small kids in the audience, sees the Ruritanians coming this way, they've got a big black flag with a skull and crossbones on, start screaming, because they're the baddies, okay? They're the Ruritanians, and they're coming to capture. You must have been to one panto, where are they? Right, here they come. Right, that's the Ruritanians. They're the bad guys, remember that. Ruritanians get their kit from all over the place. Now, what have they got? They've got a tank here. The tank they've got, the Ruritanians, is a really good tank. They bought that off the Germans. Now, after the Second World War, when the Germans were allowed to build tanks again, they said, we're not going to build big, heavy tanks with massively thick armour like the Tiger. We're going to build a tank that's just so fast on the battlefield, no one will be able to keep up with us and knock us out. And that's this tank, the Leopard tank. It's got a tremendous, you can hear that rumbling great diesel engine in the back. That powers the tank around really quickly. They bought a gun off the British, that's called a 105mm gun. A really powerful anti-tank gun. And they made a cracking tank. And it was such a good tank that lots of countries around the world, including the Ruritanians, they bought this Leopard tank. They weren't so worried about the thickness of the armour, they were looking for speed and hitting power. And with that 105mm L7 British gun, tremendously accurate, tremendously powerful, it would knock out any tank anywhere at the time. So it looked like at last the Ruritanians have found their target, which is the mound there. And it looked like he's going to go and take our flag down and put his own flag up, which if you, we want to hear what you think about that in a moment. So they've captured the mound. Now the thing to remember with tanks always have the thickest armour on the front. So you always try and point your tank to where you're going to be attacked from, so you've got the best protection. So evidently now the Ruritanians have captured the mound at last. It took him long enough, but he's got it. They think they're going to be attacked from down the other end of the field there. Now, let's see if you were paying attention a bit earlier on. What would be the first thing? Let's just imagine the British Army's got to come along and capture this position back again off the Ruritanians. What's the first thing the British Army's going to need to do in a situation like this? What's the first thing they need to find out? There we go, and shout it out, go on. Make a cup of tea. No, we're talking about the Army, not the RAF. Come on, what would the Army do in circumstances like this? Right, someone was paying attention, well done. They send out their reconnaissance or their scouting vehicle to find out where the enemy is, first of all, before they put in their attack. And the reconnaissance vehicle, that can radio back all the information. Not only how many Ruritanians are here, look like they've only come with one tank and the guy in charge doesn't look very disciplined, does he? He can't even have a shave. So they need to find all these things out before they send their main force forward. The other great thing, of course, is when that reconnaissance vehicle is going forward, it can radio back to call in artillery fire down on the enemy position as well. So once they've called down that artillery fire, it'll keep the enemy soldiers' heads down while you're busy putting together your plans before you're going to attack. Now, as I said earlier on, hopefully you don't go bumping into the enemy like this, because you're probably about a mile away in the woods down the road looking at everything through your binoculars, but it does happen in reality. But the key thing is if you get the information, what's the best way forward, how's the best way to attack the Ruritanians to get our position captured back off them. The Army has a phrase, time spent on reconnaissance is rarely wasted, so it's very important they find that information out before they commit to the attack. Now, as we all know, the British Army is pretty busy around the world at the moment, so they've called on the Bovington Tank Museum Sherman to take on the Ruritanians today. And those of you can see down the far end of the field, there's also our 432 Armoured personnel carrier that's following it up. And however many spy satellites, jets, whatever we've got in terms of technology these days, we still need infantry to hold and catch the ground. So very important infantry. Now the Ruritanians, they're putting fire back down on our Sherman, and if you keep an eye on, there's our 432. Don't forget the infantry at the back of the Armoured personnel carrier, they could have been bouncing around in the back of that for the last half hour or so. So they always try and point the vehicle at where they think the enemy are when they stop, so the guys jumping out the back know in what direction they're attacking. The Sherman's worked its way, it's got a hit on the Ruritanians there, it's worked its way up the flank, and there's our 432 now, ready to debus, as it's called, the infantry, to put them in the attack. And here they come, here comes our volunteers out the back of the vehicle. They've got to be a bit careful today, as you can imagine, it's a bit of a slippery quagmire out there at the moment out on our field. So they're lining themselves up, ready to put in what the Army would call a section attack. The Army, very important about the training of this, the Army doesn't like straight lines just for the sake of don't they look pretty or for discipline's sake. Straight lines are important in the Army for very, very practical reasons as well. This section attack, where they're coming forward at one section at a time, dropping down, then the other section comes forward, they do it so that you don't get in front of your mate and get shot up the backside. The media will call that friendly fire. It's the most unfriendly fire going if you're hit by your own troops. So very important, they keep spaced out and they're coming forward at a section at a time. Determined bunch, it looks like we've got here today, our recruits. Coming section, working their way forward. They've got the Ruritanians in sight. They know what they're attacking. It's very important they keep motivated. And the section commander getting them to charge the Ruritanians, and pathetic. Ruritanians are flung in the towel already. Well done, our volunteers there. Well done. Now it actually takes the British Army about 6 weeks to do